The legacy of Christopher Columbus has been the subject of debate for centuries, and with good reason. For many, he is celebrated as a daring explorer who bridged two worlds and set in motion the great age of discovery. Yet for others, he represents the beginning of centuries of exploitation, violence, and colonization that devastated indigenous populations across the Americas. Columbus, the man who discovered the New World, is now at the center of a modern reckoning, where the myth surrounding his voyages is being challenged, deconstructed, and reinterpreted. As statues are toppled and debates rage over the significance of Columbus Day, the man and his legacy have become symbols of a deeper, more uncomfortable conversation about colonialism, history, and the power of memory itself. In this ongoing re-examination, Columbus is no longer just a historical figure. He has become a mirror reflecting the complexities of how we view the past and, ultimately, ourselves. In the annals of history, few names provoke such fierce debate and enduring fascination as Christopher Columbus. Hailed by some as the discoverer of the New World and condemned by others as a symbol of colonial violence, the man behind the myth remains a complex and often misunderstood figure. To understand Columbus's later ventures into the Atlantic and his pivotal role in shaping global history, it is crucial to begin at the beginning, to examine his early life, his formative years, and the influences that shaped his relentless drive to reach unknown shores. Christopher Columbus was born between August 25 and October 31, 1451, in the bustling port city of Genoa, in what is now northwestern Italy. At the time, Genoa was one of the most powerful maritime republics in Europe, boasting a rich history of seafaring and commerce. Columbus was born into a modest family. His father, Domenico Colombo, was a wool weaver and small-scale merchant, while his mother, Susanna Fontanarossa, managed the household. Life in Genoa in the mid-15th century was shaped by trade, craftsmanship, and competition. The city was a melting pot of cultures, with merchants, sailors, and travelers arriving from across the Mediterranean and beyond. This environment deeply influenced Columbus, who grew up hearing stories of exotic lands, rich ports, and the fortunes that could be made by brave men who took to the sea. Columbus had three brothers, Bartholomew, Giovanni Pellegrino, and Giacomo, also known as Diego, and a sister. Among them, Bartholomew would later play an important role in Columbus's voyages, working alongside him as a navigator and mapmaker. Though not born into wealth or nobility, Columbus's family was not destitute, and he received enough education to learn basic Latin, mathematics, and geography, skills that would prove crucial in his later career. By his own account, Columbus went to sea as early as age 14. Though this claim is debated by modern historians, it is clear that he developed maritime skills at a young age. In his youth, he likely worked aboard various merchant ships, gaining hands-on experience in sailing, navigation, and trade. These were dangerous times for sailors. Piracy, storms, and warfare were constant threats on the open sea. But it was also an era of immense opportunity. During the 1470s, Columbus served aboard Genoese and Portuguese vessels, traveling to destinations across the Mediterranean and the Atlantic coast of Africa. Some accounts suggest he may have sailed as far as the British Isles or Iceland. Whether these claims are exaggerated or not, it is certain that Columbus spent much of his early life absorbing knowledge of tides, winds, and celestial navigation. These skills, honed through hardship and repetition, laid the groundwork for the daring voyages he would later undertake. In the early 1470s, Columbus moved to Lisbon, the capital of Portugal, then a hub of global exploration. Portugal's Prince Henry the Navigator had already set the country on a path of maritime expansion, establishing routes down the coast of Africa in search of gold, ivory, and a sea route to India. Lisbon's docks teemed with sailors returning from foreign expeditions, and the city boasted some of the finest mapmakers, instrument makers, and scholars of navigation in Europe. Columbus's move to Lisbon was a turning point. He worked with his brother Bartholomew, who was employed as a cartographer. Together, they studied existing maps and theories about the geography of the world. While in Lisbon, Columbus married Filipa Moniz Perestrello, a noblewoman and daughter of a Portuguese knight. This marriage gave him access to maritime records, including those from her late father, who had been the governor of the island of Porto Santo in the Madeiras, a Portuguese outpost in the Atlantic. Through these connections, Columbus deepened his knowledge of the Atlantic islands and began to believe strongly in the possibility of sailing westward to reach the riches of Asia. He read the works of ancient scholars like Ptolemy, as well as more contemporary writings such as Marco Polo's travels and The Travels of Sir John Mandeville, both filled with tales of vast wealth, exotic peoples, and distant empires. By the 1480s, Columbus had formulated a radical theory. Rather than sailing around Africa to reach Asia, as the Portuguese were doing, he believed one could sail west across the Atlantic and reach the eastern shores of Asia. His reasoning was based on several key assumptions, some accurate, others deeply flawed. Firstly, Columbus underestimated the circumference of the Earth. He accepted the idea that the Earth was round, as most educated Europeans did at the time, but he believed it was significantly smaller than it actually is. He also overestimated the size of the Eurasian landmass, believing that Japan and China lay much closer to Europe than they actually did. Relying on miscalculations from earlier scholars and his own interpretation of maps, Columbus concluded that Asia could be reached in just a few weeks of sailing westward. What he could not have known, what no one in Europe knew, was that two massive continents, North and South America, lay directly in his path. Despite the flawed science, Columbus's theory was revolutionary for its boldness and daring. At a time when sailors feared sea monsters and believed the ocean dropped off into nothingness, Columbus envisioned a path to the riches of Cathay, China, Cipango, Japan, and India. His vision was driven not only by curiosity, but also by a desire for wealth, fame, and a sense of divine mission. Columbus was not just a sailor and navigator. He was also a deeply religious man. Throughout his writings, he expresses a belief that his journeys were ordained by God, and that he was chosen to carry Christianity to heathen lands. His religious zeal was tied closely to the Catholic faith, and he saw exploration as a divine duty. This belief in destiny gave Columbus a sense of purpose that set him apart from other adventurers. He often interpreted events, such as favorable winds or fortunate encounters, as signs of God's favor. He envisioned his discoveries as part of a grand, providential plan to spread Christianity and perhaps finance a new crusade to reclaim the Holy Land. At the same time, Columbus was ambitious. He dreamed of titles, lands, and riches. In his petitions to European monarchs, he requested not only funding but also noble status and the hereditary title of Admiral of the Ocean Sea. His ambition was not only personal but dynastic. He wanted to establish a legacy that would elevate his family for generations. Fueled by his ideas and driven by ambition, Columbus began seeking royal patronage to fund his voyage westward. His first appeals went to the Portuguese court, but they were rejected. The Portuguese were focused on the eastern route around Africa and viewed Columbus's westward plan as unproven and risky. Undeterred, Columbus turned to Spain, where he spent years trying to convince King Ferdinand of Aragon and Queen Isabella of Castile to support his venture. Spain, newly unified through the marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella and victorious in the Reconquista against the Moors, was eager to compete with Portugal for overseas dominance. However, Columbus faced skepticism from the Spanish royal advisors. His calculations were questioned, and his demands for titles and authority were viewed as excessive. For years, his proposal was delayed, examined, and ultimately shelved. Columbus grew increasingly desperate, traveling from court to court, even appealing to England and France with little success. While the monarchs remained hesitant, Columbus gained support from others. Influential courtiers, theologians, and explorers believed in his vision. One of his key supporters was Luis de Santangel, the royal treasurer of Aragon, who eventually helped persuade Queen Isabella to reconsider. Other clerics and members of the court, inspired by Columbus's piety and perseverance, saw his proposal as both a spiritual and strategic opportunity. Finally, in 1492, after the fall of Granada and the completion of Spain's reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula, the crown agreed to fund Columbus's voyage. The terms of the capitulations of Santa Fe granted Columbus his long-sought titles: Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Viceroy, and Governor of any lands he discovered, as well as a tenth of the profits from his venture. The early life of Christopher Columbus reveals a man shaped by the currents of history, a child of Genoa, a sailor forged in the Mediterranean, a dreamer captivated by maps and legends, and a devout Christian with unshakable belief in his destiny. His ideas were bold, his calculations deeply flawed, and his ambition limitless. But what set Columbus apart was his perseverance. When he set sail from Palos de la Frontera in August 1492, he carried not only the hopes of a nation but the weight of his own lifelong quest. The voyage that would change the course of human history had its roots in a young Genoese boy's dream of the sea, dreams nurtured in shipyards, chart rooms, and the corridors of power. In the closing decades of the 15th century, as European powers vied for global influence and wealth, a Genoese mariner named Christopher Columbus was consumed by a singular vision. He believed that it was possible to reach the rich markets of Asia by sailing directly westward across the Atlantic Ocean. Though this idea was not without precedent, it was viewed with skepticism and even ridicule by the political and scholarly establishments of the day. Yet Columbus's belief was so intense, and his determination so unwavering, that he would spend over a decade seeking support for what most regarded as a fantastical and potentially fatal expedition. Columbus's vision was born not of idle speculation, but from a lifetime spent at sea, in shipyards, among maps, sailors, and scholars. He was a man shaped by maritime experiences and steeped in the lore of distant lands. While in Lisbon during the 1470s and early 1480s, he became increasingly convinced that a route to the East Indies, lands described in mesmerizing detail in the accounts of Marco Polo, could be reached by crossing the Atlantic rather than rounding the Cape of Good Hope. The Portuguese were already heavily invested in the latter route, and Columbus's proposal ran counter to their cautious, coast-hugging method of exploration. Nevertheless, his ideas continued to crystallize into a firm conviction that the Earth's circumference was smaller than widely believed, and that Asia extended much farther east than most maps depicted. With these beliefs in mind, Columbus began approaching various European courts. His plan was audacious. He would command a fleet westward across what many believed to be an unending ocean, aiming to reach the fabled lands of Cipango, Japan, Cathay, China, and the Indies. There, he believed, untold wealth in spices, silks, and gold awaited. But for his plan to work, he needed ships, men, and royal backing, resources he did not possess. Thus began a long and often humiliating journey to secure the patronage he needed. His first appeal was made to the Portuguese crown. King John II of Portugal was no stranger to exploration and had a keen interest in expanding maritime power. However, Columbus's proposal did not align with the Portuguese strategy, which was focused on exploring down the African coast toward India. The king submitted Columbus's plan to a royal commission of geographers and navigators. The conclusion was damning. Columbus had grossly miscalculated the size of the globe and severely underestimated the distance to Asia. Worse still, the commission believed that any land that existed to the west of Europe would likely be either unreachable or useless. Columbus's idea was thus rejected. Despite the rejection, Columbus remained in Portugal for several more years. During this time, he attempted to raise private funding and continued to revise and defend his geographical theories. He also sent his brother Bartholomew to the court of King Henry VII of England with similar proposals, though Bartholomew's efforts were met with delays and yielded no immediate success. As time wore on, Columbus grew increasingly despondent, yet he refused to abandon his dream. By the mid-1480s, Portugal was no longer a viable option. Columbus turned his eyes to Spain, a kingdom undergoing significant transformation. The union of Castile and Aragon through the marriage of Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand had created a powerful, unified monarchy. The Spanish Reconquista, a centuries-long campaign to expel Muslim rule from the Iberian Peninsula, was reaching its final stages. It was in this environment, one charged with religious fervor, rising nationalism, and growing imperial ambition, that Columbus hoped to find a more receptive audience. When Columbus arrived in Spain in 1485, he settled in the monastery of La Rabida, near the town of Palos. There, he formed an important relationship with the friar Juan Pérez, a former confessor to Queen Isabella. Pérez became one of Columbus's early and most loyal supporters, helping him gain access to influential circles. He also introduced Columbus to several nobles and scholars, including Hernando de Talavera, a royal. Through these connections, Columbus was granted an audience with the Spanish monarchs. He presented his plan in detail, offering to open a new trade route to Asia that would enrich Spain and bring glory to Christianity. He proposed that in exchange for royal backing he be given high titles, such as Admiral of the Ocean Sea, and significant shares in any profits or lands discovered. These demands were not modest. Columbus viewed himself not merely as a hired navigator, but as an agent of destiny, worthy of noble rank and perpetual governance over new territories. Despite the support of figures like Pérez and the financial official Luis de Santangel, the Spanish court remained hesitant. Isabella and Ferdinand were embroiled in the final campaign against the Emirate of Granada, the last Muslim stronghold in Spain. With their military and financial resources stretched, they could not afford to invest in what many considered a speculative venture. Moreover, Columbus's geographic assumptions, particularly his belief that Asia lay just a few weeks' sail west of Europe, were viewed as dangerously flawed. Once again, a commission of scholars reviewed his proposal. The verdict was similar to the Portuguese response. The plan was unrealistic and too risky. For a lesser man, such a rejection might have marked the end of the journey. But Columbus was not easily deterred. He remained in Spain, living on the margins of royal favor, lobbying courtiers, writing letters, and presenting arguments to anyone who would listen. He traveled extensively across Andalusia, petitioning dukes, counts, and cardinals. At times he lived in poverty, relying on the charity of friends and the support of religious figures. Yet his tone never changed. He remained steadfast in his belief that he was meant to cross the ocean, and that doing so would bring immense riches to whoever backed him. In the late 1480s, Columbus made one last desperate appeal to the Spanish court. This time, however, there was a change in atmosphere. The war with Granada was nearing its end, and Spain was emerging as a powerful and ambitious nation. Several influential courtiers began to view Columbus's proposal in a new light. Luis de Santangel, in particular, became a decisive advocate. A skilled financier and trusted advisor to King Ferdinand, Santangel argued that the potential rewards of Columbus's voyage far outweighed the relatively modest cost of funding it. He also emphasized the religious and symbolic importance of such a venture, spreading Christianity, reaching unknown peoples, and potentially striking a blow against Islam by outflanking the Ottoman Empire via a western route. Another important ally emerged in Queen Isabella's inner circle, the royal chamberlain Juan Cabrero. Both he and Santangel worked to arrange another audience for Columbus. At this crucial juncture, fate seemed to conspire in his favor. The surrender of Granada in January 1492 marked a turning point in Spanish history. With the Reconquista complete, Spain was ready to project its power abroad. Queen Isabella, in particular, saw the chance to rival Portugal's maritime empire and perhaps surpass it. After much debate, the monarchs agreed to Columbus's terms, albeit reluctantly. In April 1492, the Crown and Columbus signed the capitulations of Santa Fe. The agreement was generous. Columbus was granted the hereditary title of Admiral of the Ocean Sea, as well as governorship over any new lands he might claim. He would receive 1/10 of all profits derived from his discoveries. These were extraordinary concessions for a man of humble birth, but they reflected Columbus's relentless negotiation and unwavering belief in the value of his plan. The significance of this moment cannot be overstated. It was the culmination of more than a decade of lobbying, rejection, and tireless advocacy. Few people in history have pursued a single idea with such intensity and endured so many setbacks in pursuit of it. Columbus's quest for a sponsor is not just a story of geopolitical calculation. It is a tale of faith, persistence, and personal ambition. His victory was also the product of timing. Had he approached Spain even a year earlier, he might have failed once more. But the convergence of Spain's post-Reconquista momentum, the growing appetite for overseas expansion, and the presence of powerful advocates created a narrow window of opportunity. Columbus seized it with both hands. By the summer of 1492, Columbus had secured ships, crew, and funding. The stage was set for the voyage that would reshape the world. Yet it is important to remember that behind the iconic departure of the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria lies a longer and lesser-known journey. A journey of dreams deferred, doubts confronted, and a stubborn, solitary man's refusal to give up. It is this story, perhaps more than the voyage itself, that reveals the heart of who Columbus was. He was a man possessed by vision, sometimes blinded by ambition, but always moving forward. His belief in his destiny never faltered, even when the world turned its back on him. And when he finally received the support he so desperately sought, he did not hesitate. For Columbus, the moment of decision had arrived, and the ocean awaited. In the sultry heat of August 1492, 3 ships, small by modern standards but loaded with immense ambition, slipped away from the harbor of Palos de la Frontera. These vessels, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, carried not just men and supplies, but the accumulated hopes of a man who had struggled for years to convince the world of his vision. Christopher Columbus, now styled Admiral of the Ocean Sea, stood on the deck of the Santa Maria, the flagship of the fleet, and watched as the coastline of Spain faded behind him. Before him lay the vast, mysterious expanse of the Atlantic, a place that few Europeans had dared to venture far into and fewer still had returned from. He believed it would take just a few weeks to reach Asia, or at least some part of the Indies. The prevailing knowledge of the time warned otherwise. But Columbus did not set sail guided only by maps or measurements. He was driven by faith in divine providence, in his navigational instincts, and in the purpose that he believed had been set for him by God. The fleet first headed southward along the coast of Africa to the Canary Islands, a necessary stop for provisions and repairs. The Pinta had already suffered damage to her rudder, prompting suspicions of sabotage by crew members fearful of the voyage or possibly influenced by Portuguese interests. The rudder was repaired and the fleet regrouped. By early September, with the ships provisioned and the winds favorable, Columbus ordered them to strike out westward into waters that no European ship had deliberately crossed. There were no accurate charts to guide them, only vague accounts, fragmented knowledge of the Atlantic's breadth, and the admiral's own calculations, which underestimated the Earth's circumference by a wide margin. As the days turned into weeks, the sea around them stretched endlessly. The winds, caught in the northeast trade, carried the ships steadily onward, but it was not long before restlessness stirred among the crews. Many of the sailors had been coerced or pardoned criminals, tempted by the promise of golden titles, yet untrained for such a long and uncertain voyage. Though Columbus had promised a relatively short journey, the horizon offered no land. Doubts grew. Some of the men whispered fears of sea monsters, of falling off the edge of the world. Others, more practical, feared they would simply run out of food and fresh water before finding any sign of land. Each day seemed to repeat the last, a desolate sea, a foreign sky, and no destination in sight. To manage morale, Columbus employed a psychological tactic. While he kept 2 logs, one accurate and one falsified, he revealed only the shorter daily distances to his crew, hiding just how far west they had truly sailed. In reality, the fleet was pushing deep into unknown waters. Columbus believed they would find Cipango or the outskirts of Asia at any moment, but the environment offered only deceptive signs. Floating bits of vegetation, drifting logs, and seabirds gave rise to constant rumors that land must be near. There were false alarms, bursts of excitement followed by crushing disappointment. One sailor sighted what he thought was land, only for it to dissolve into mist. The strain grew heavier with each passing day. On several occasions, Columbus faced the possibility of mutiny. His authority, while bolstered by royal commission, rested precariously on a thin foundation of charisma, promise, and determination. Despite mounting pressure, he remained resolute. His journal reveals a mind teetering between confidence and desperation, always interpreting natural signs through a hopeful lens. He prayed constantly, encouraging religious rituals on board. At night, he would gaze upward, seeking guidance from the stars. To Columbus, this voyage was not just an enterprise, it was a holy mission. He imagined himself a chosen instrument of God, destined to open new lands for the crown and Christendom. This conviction gave him strength, but it also isolated him from many of his sailors, who increasingly saw his single-mindedness as madness. Then came October 7th. The crews began seeing more flocks of birds, especially land-loving species like the petrel and the frigate bird. Columbus took these as signs of nearby land and adjusted course to follow their flight path. Still, no land appeared. On October 10th, a critical moment arrived. The crews, especially those on the Pinta, approached open rebellion. Angry and exhausted, they demanded the voyage be turned back. Columbus, sensing the edge of mutiny, promised to return if land was not seen in 3 more days. It was a dangerous gamble, but one that paid off. On the night of October 11th, just hours before that deadline expired, a lookout on the Pinta, Rodrigo de Triana, shouted the cry that would change history. Tierra! Land had been sighted, though Columbus would later claim he saw a faint light hours earlier. Possibly to ensure the promised reward for first sighting land, it was Triana's call that sparked celebration across the fleet. The long and harrowing voyage had reached its goal. At dawn on October 12, 1492, the ships approached a lush, green island. Columbus, dressed in ceremonial robes and carrying the royal standard, came ashore and knelt in prayer, thanking God for their safe passage. He named the island San Salvador and claimed it for the Spanish crown. The precise location of this landfall remains debated by historians, but it is generally accepted to be one of the Bahamian Islands. What Columbus had found, however, was not Asia, though he believed it to be so, but a vast archipelago that would later come to be known as the West Indies. The native people who greeted them, the Taino, were generous and curious. They wore little clothing, carried no weapons of war, and offered gifts of parrots, cotton, and food. Columbus noted their hospitality but also observed their vulnerability. In his journals, he remarked that with just 50 men he could subjugate them and compel them to do as he wished. This comment would foreshadow the darker legacies of the age of exploration. From San Salvador, the fleet explored further. Columbus sailed on to other islands, including present-day Cuba, which he believed might be the mainland of Cathay, China, and Hispaniola, which he thought could be near the rich lands described by Marco Polo. The coasts were lush and filled with signs of human habitation. On Hispaniola, Columbus established friendly relations with a local chieftain named Guacanagari, who offered gifts and allowed the Europeans to rest and build shelter. However, the Santa Maria soon ran aground on a reef on Christmas Day and was destroyed. Using the salvaged timbers, Columbus constructed a small fort named La Navidad and left a garrison of about 40 men there. He believed he had laid the foundations for a new colony that would flourish under Spanish guidance. While the indigenous people remained peaceful during these first encounters, misunderstandings and small conflicts hinted at future troubles. Communication was difficult, and the Europeans often misinterpreted local customs. Columbus, convinced that gold was plentiful in the region, continually pressed the natives for information about where it could be found. Though he was shown small ornaments and told vague stories of gold-rich lands inland, no great treasure was discovered. Still, Columbus collected samples, plants, animals, a few trinkets of gold, and prepared to return to Spain. By early January 1493, the remaining 2 ships began the long voyage back. The journey home was perilous. A severe storm struck off the Azores, nearly sinking the fleet. Columbus, fearing he might not survive, placed a detailed account of the voyage into a cask and cast it into the sea, hoping it would be found and serve as testament to what had been accomplished. He eventually made it to Lisbon, where news of his journey spread quickly, and from there to Spain. He arrived to great fanfare in March 1493, carrying exotic birds, unfamiliar fruits, and several native Tainos, presented as proof of his achievement. The reaction in Spain was electric. Columbus was welcomed like a hero. His voyage had confirmed the possibility of lands across the Atlantic, lands rich in promise, if not in immediate wealth. Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand received him with honor and reaffirmed the titles and rewards promised in the capitulations of Santa Fe. Columbus's status was transformed overnight from obscure navigator to famed explorer, from a dismissed dreamer to a man with the world at his feet. Yet even in triumph, Columbus misread what he had discovered. He remained convinced he had reached islands off the coast of Asia and believed that further exploration would reveal the cities and empires described by ancient sources. The idea that he had stumbled upon a new world was not yet within his comprehension. His view, shaped by religious purpose and medieval geography, could not yet accommodate the possibility of an entirely unknown continent. Nonetheless, his first voyage had succeeded in its most daring element. It had crossed the Atlantic Ocean and returned. The implications were enormous. New trade routes, new territories, and new peoples had been revealed. Though the riches he had promised were not immediately evident, the symbolic power of his achievement was undeniable. His journey shattered old boundaries and ushered in a new era of exploration, colonization, and, tragically, exploitation. The voyage of 1492 would soon be mythologized and romanticized, its darker aspects obscured by narratives of bravery and discovery. Columbus himself would sail again, 3 more times, in pursuit of ever greater claims. But it was that first crossing, that plunge into the unknown, that defined his legacy. It was the voyage that gambled everything on one belief, that the world was not as distant, as fragmented, or as impenetrable as it seemed, and in doing so, it changed the course of human history. Christopher Columbus's return to Spain in 1493 marked the culmination of a voyage that had not only defied the boundaries of the known world, but also set the stage for a new era of exploration and conquest. The voyage, which had started as a gamble on an untested theory, had ended with Columbus bringing back a mixture of exotic plants, animals, and even human captives, gifts from a strange new world. Yet, what truly set Columbus apart was not the physical evidence of his journey, but the transformative effect it would have on his life and on history. After enduring weeks of peril at sea, navigating storms that nearly destroyed his fleet, and clinging to the hope of success despite constant doubts, Columbus finally sailed back into the harbors of Europe. The first leg of his return journey took him to Lisbon, where he was greeted as a hero. His arrival was cause for celebration. The city had been abuzz with rumors of his extraordinary discoveries. Yet it was not Lisbon where Columbus would receive his most significant recognition. It was in Spain, the kingdom that had sponsored his audacious voyage. Upon arriving in Spain, Columbus was met with a mixture of awe and excitement. In the years leading up to his departure, Columbus had struggled to convince the monarchs, Queen Isabella I of Castile and King Ferdinand II of Aragon, that his vision of sailing westward to reach Asia was not only feasible but potentially profitable. His proposal had been rejected by numerous courts across Europe, including those of Portugal and Italy. But after the success of his first voyage, Columbus now held the key to riches and global influence, and his return signaled the beginning of a period in which his name would be enshrined in history. Columbus's journey had opened up a whole new realm of possibilities for Spain. His discovery of new lands in the West was seen as proof that he had indeed found a route to Asia, despite the geographical reality that would later prove otherwise. The Spanish monarchs were eager to claim the wealth and prestige that came with the discovery of these new lands. Columbus was not merely an explorer returning home after a successful voyage. He was now a living symbol of Spanish power and global expansion. His first public appearance in Spain was a grand affair. Columbus entered the royal court in Barcelona, where he was ceremoniously received by the monarchs. The celebration of Columbus's return was more than just a personal triumph. It was also a political event. His success was not only a victory for him, but for Isabella and Ferdinand as well. The monarchs had staked their reputation and their kingdom's fortunes on Columbus's voyage, and now they had a tangible reward: territories and riches that promised to make Spain a dominant power in the world. Columbus's discoveries were also framed as a divine blessing, aligning his success with religious righteousness. He had carried out his mission under the banner of Christianity, with the goal of spreading the faith and converting the heathens of the New World. Columbus's public image, carefully shaped by both himself and his patrons, quickly became that of a divinely inspired hero. He was not simply an explorer, but a visionary who had defied the expectations of his contemporaries, and his success in discovering new lands was seen as a fulfillment of prophecies and promises. The Spanish crown, keen to maintain their control over the new territories, elevated Columbus to a position of honor, granting him titles and privileges that enhanced his status. In addition to the title of Admiral of the Ocean Sea, which had been granted to him at the start of the voyage, Columbus was given the title of Viceroy of the Indies and Governor of all lands he discovered. These titles came with immense power and wealth, though they would also bring their own complications and frustrations in the years to come. While Columbus basked in the triumph of his discovery, his first return to Spain also revealed some of the more complicated aspects of his legacy. Despite his public reception, there were still skeptics and critics, particularly among the educated elites and those who had opposed his journey from the beginning. They questioned the accuracy of Columbus's claims and the feasibility of the journey, noting that he had not reached Asia as he had promised, but had instead found an entirely unknown continent. The scientific community remained unconvinced, and some of Columbus's contemporaries even ridiculed his assertion that he had reached the East Indies. His navigational skills and geographical understanding were still viewed as rudimentary by the standards of the time, and many believed that his discoveries were a result of luck rather than skill. Columbus, however, was not concerned with these doubts. He was determined to maintain his image as the man who had opened the world to Spain. He took great care to frame his discoveries as the fulfillment of a divine mission, linking them to the greater Christian cause. He spoke frequently of his desire to convert the indigenous peoples of the lands he had encountered and spread Christianity throughout the newly discovered territories. This religious angle helped solidify his reputation as a heroic figure, and it was embraced by both the Spanish monarchs and the Catholic Church. The papacy, in particular, was quick to lend its support to Columbus's achievements, recognizing his voyages as a triumph of Christian expansion. In 1493, just months after his return, Pope Alexander VI issued the Bull of Donation, granting Spain the rights to all lands discovered by Columbus in the New World, thus formalizing Spain's colonial ambitions. Despite his official recognition and the public celebrations of his success, Columbus's return was far from a smooth path to perpetual glory. His time as viceroy and governor of the new territories was fraught with challenges. He struggled to manage the complex realities of colonial governance, including conflicts with the indigenous populations, internal disagreements within his own ranks, and the challenges of securing resources and supplies for the settlement of the New World. His leadership, which had been largely unchallenged during the voyage, was now tested in a very different environment. The hierarchical nature of the Spanish court and the political intrigue that followed Columbus's return often overshadowed his efforts to establish a successful colony. His relationship with the Spanish monarchy also began to sour over time. As Columbus prepared for his second voyage, tensions began to emerge between him and the crown, especially as complaints about his leadership in the New World started to reach Spain. The Spaniards who had settled in the islands were unhappy with the conditions and the lack of material wealth, and Columbus's failure to find gold or riches led to criticism from those who had expected more immediate rewards. Moreover, the complex and often contradictory nature of his claims and promises made it difficult for the Spanish monarchy to fully support him in the long term. By the time Columbus returned to Spain after his second voyage, his relationship with the monarchy had become strained. Despite his earlier successes, he was no longer the unquestioned hero he had once been. His public image, which had been meticulously crafted as a triumphant explorer, began to tarnish. Columbus's failures in the New World, combined with the challenges of his leadership, left him vulnerable to criticism from rival explorers and factions within the Spanish court. In 1500 he was even briefly arrested and sent back to Spain in chains, though he was later released and his titles were restored. Nevertheless, Columbus's first voyage, which had begun as an uncertain venture across an unknown ocean, had irrevocably altered the course of history. The recognition he received upon his return laid the groundwork for the expansion of Spain's empire, and his name became synonymous with the age of exploration. Despite the controversies that surrounded his later years, Columbus remained an enduring symbol of the bold ambition and the spirit of discovery that defined the Renaissance period. His return to Spain in 1493 marked the beginning of an era in which the world was reshaped by the voyages of explorers like him, and the public recognition he received after his first voyage cemented his place in the annals of history. In the years that followed, Columbus's public image would continue to evolve. He would eventually be remembered, for better or worse, as the man who opened the New World to European exploration and colonization. His legacy would become a subject of much debate, with some hailing him as a visionary and others condemning him for the consequences of his actions in the Americas. Regardless of the differing opinions, Columbus's triumphant return to Spain set the stage for the future of the Western world, leaving a lasting mark on the pages of history. Columbus's second voyage, which began in 1493, marked a significant shift in both his personal journey and in the broader historical trajectory of European exploration and colonialism. While his first voyage had been a discovery, a daring exploration of an unknown world, the second voyage was about establishing a lasting presence in the New World, a colony that could be controlled, governed, and exploited. The initial optimism that accompanied Columbus's return to Spain quickly gave way to the harsh realities of colonization, which proved far more difficult and contentious than he had anticipated. The voyage was both an expansion of Columbus's ambitions and a lesson in the brutal challenges of building an empire across the ocean. After the monumental success of his first voyage, Columbus was granted the authority and resources to return to the New World, this time with a larger fleet and a more ambitious mandate. The Spanish monarchs, Isabella and Ferdinand, were eager to consolidate their claims over the territories Columbus had discovered and to turn the islands into prosperous colonies that could generate wealth for Spain. Columbus set sail on September 25, 1493, with a fleet of 17 ships and about 1,200 men, including settlers, priests, soldiers, and laborers. The goal was no longer just to explore, but to create a permanent Spanish presence in the Caribbean and to begin exploiting the resources that could fuel Spain's ambitions for empire building. The journey began with high hopes, but it wasn't long before problems started to emerge. Columbus's plan was to establish a colony on the island of Hispaniola, the present-day island shared by Haiti and the Dominican Republic, which he had briefly visited on his first voyage. Upon his arrival, Columbus found that the settlement he had left behind, called La Navidad, had been destroyed. His men, who had been left behind on his first voyage, had been killed by the indigenous Taino people, and the colony had been abandoned. This was a blow to Columbus's plans, but it also provided an early indication of the difficult relationships he would have with the native populations. With little choice, Columbus and his crew established a new settlement, which they named Isabella, in honor of Queen Isabella of Spain. The settlement was meant to be a launching point for further exploration and expansion. However, the initial euphoria of Columbus's discovery began to fade as the reality of governing a new colony took hold. The settlers, many of whom had little experience in colonization or agriculture, struggled to survive in the unfamiliar environment. The tropical diseases, scarce food resources, and constant threats from the indigenous people who had grown wary of the Spanish presence made it clear that this was no easy task. Despite these difficulties, Columbus continued to push forward with his plans. He was determined to establish a Spanish stronghold in the Caribbean that could serve as the base for further exploration. But the challenges soon became overwhelming. Columbus, despite his many talents as an explorer, lacked the skills required to govern effectively in the New World. He relied heavily on military force and coercion to maintain order, which alienated both the indigenous people and his own men. Columbus's leadership style, which had been effective in the early stages of his voyage, began to show cracks when faced with the complexities of colonial rule. He was also becoming increasingly frustrated by the lack of immediate wealth and resources, particularly gold, which had been one of his main objectives. In addition to these challenges, the relationship between Columbus and the native Taino people became more strained. Columbus had initially believed that the indigenous populations would be easily subjugated, but the reality was much more complicated. While some indigenous groups were initially friendly, others were resistant to Spanish colonization and exploitation. Columbus's treatment of the Taino was often harsh, and his demands for tribute and labor resulted in tensions and violence. Columbus's desire to convert the indigenous populations to Christianity led to forced conversions, and his plans for using them as laborers to extract resources from the land only deepened the resentment of the native people. The brutality of his methods would have long-lasting consequences, not only for Columbus himself, but for the future of Spanish colonialism in the Americas. As time passed, Columbus's inability to manage the colony effectively became more evident. The settlers were increasingly unhappy with his leadership, and a series of uprisings against his rule broke out. Many of the settlers who had expected quick riches and a prosperous life in the New World grew disillusioned with Columbus's promises. Instead of finding golden treasures, they found themselves embroiled in a harsh and unforgiving environment, where survival was a daily struggle. The native populations who had initially been subjugated began to resist more forcefully, leading to violent confrontations. These tensions, combined with the scarcity of resources and the failure to establish a sustainable colonial infrastructure, made the settlement on Hispaniola increasingly unstable. One of the most serious challenges for Columbus was the lack of strong leadership within his ranks. Many of the men he had brought on the voyage were not experienced colonists or soldiers, but rather adventurers and opportunists. They were not motivated by loyalty to Columbus or a desire to build a lasting colony, but by the hope of quick riches. This lack of cohesion among the settlers was a significant obstacle to Columbus's efforts to establish a stable colony. Discontent began to spread, and rumors of Columbus's failures reached Spain. In 1495, Columbus returned to Spain to report on his progress and to seek additional resources for the colony. While in Spain, Columbus faced increasing pressure from the Spanish crown and other figures at court. The Spanish monarchs had invested heavily in his voyages and had high expectations for the success of the New World colonies. The failure to extract significant wealth, particularly gold, had made Columbus's position more tenuous. His earlier success in discovering the New World had been a triumph, but the reality of establishing a functioning colony was proving much more difficult. Columbus's reports back to Spain were often vague and optimistic, downplaying the challenges he faced and focusing on the potential of the new lands. Yet his political enemies in Spain were quick to exploit any signs of failure. Columbus returned to the New World in 1496, this time with a smaller fleet and more soldiers. His second voyage was marked by a series of conflicts with both the indigenous people and his own settlers. Despite his best efforts, he was unable to restore order in the colony. The situation on Hispaniola continued to deteriorate, with food shortages, disease, and unrest growing more severe. The settlers were increasingly dissatisfied with Columbus's leadership, and many of them sought a change in governance. Meanwhile, Columbus's relationship with the Spanish crown became more strained, as he struggled to deliver the wealth and resources that the monarchs had expected. As Columbus became more desperate to maintain his authority, his methods became increasingly brutal. He implemented harsh measures to control the indigenous people, including the forced labor system known as the encomienda, which allowed Spanish settlers to extract labor from the native populations. This system was widely abused and led to the widespread mistreatment and exploitation of the indigenous people. The arrival of African slaves to the colony further complicated the dynamics, as Columbus and other Spanish authorities sought to establish a system of labor that could sustain the colonial economy. These actions, which laid the foundation for the brutal and exploitative nature of Spanish colonialism in the Americas, would have long-lasting effects on the indigenous populations and the future of the New World. The second voyage of Columbus thus became a pivotal moment in his life and in the history of the Americas. What had started as a moment of triumph quickly devolved into a struggle for survival and control. The idealistic vision of a peaceful colonial project in the New World had been shattered by the brutal realities of exploitation, conflict, and mismanagement. The failure to establish a prosperous and stable colony led to growing tensions both within the Spanish court and among Columbus's own men. His authority began to weaken, and his legacy as a leader and explorer became increasingly complicated. The second voyage revealed the true complexity of colonial expansion, an effort that was fraught with moral, political, and practical challenges that would shape the course of history for centuries to come. Columbus's second voyage was a tragic and brutal chapter in the history of the Americas. It exposed the flaws in his leadership and the harsh realities of colonialism. While Columbus's initial discovery had brought him fame and fortune, his efforts to expand the Spanish Empire in the New World resulted in a legacy of violence, exploitation, and disillusionment that would echo through the ages. By the time Columbus embarked on his third voyage in 1498, his once promising legacy had begun to unravel. His second voyage had exposed the brutal realities of colonization, and while he had succeeded in expanding Spain's territorial claims, his methods were increasingly viewed with skepticism. His third voyage was an attempt to redeem himself in the eyes of the Spanish crown, but it marked the beginning of his downfall, both politically and personally. What had started as an ambitious exploration soon descended into doubts, discontent, and even chains as Columbus's authority was increasingly questioned, culminating in his arrest and return to Spain in disgrace. The primary objective of Columbus's third voyage was to continue exploring the New World and to further expand Spanish territorial claims. By this time, Columbus's achievements were seen through a more critical lens. Though he had been credited with discovering a vast new world, he had failed to deliver the riches that Spain had been hoping for. The Spanish monarchy had expected immediate wealth, particularly gold, but instead Columbus had found only limited resources. His inability to establish a stable, prosperous colony was becoming a serious issue, and the crown was beginning to lose confidence in his ability to govern the territories he had claimed. Nevertheless, Columbus set sail from Spain on May 30, 1498, with 6 ships and a crew that included his brother, Bartholomew, and a mix of settlers, soldiers, and explorers. This time, he was given a more specific mandate to continue the search for a western route to Asia, a task that had driven his initial voyages. Columbus's ships first reached the Caribbean islands, where he continued his exploration of the New World. After spending some time in the islands, he set out to explore the South American coast, believing that he might have reached the outskirts of the Asian continent. However, his exploration led him to the mouth of the Orinoco River in present-day Venezuela, an area he believed to be the gateway to the riches of Asia. The third voyage was marked by some notable achievements in terms of discovery. Columbus became the first European to explore the South American continent, and his observations of the geography of the region were valuable in shaping subsequent expeditions. However, these discoveries were overshadowed by the mounting problems in the colonies he had left behind in the Caribbean. His authority as governor was increasingly undermined, and dissatisfaction among the settlers reached a boiling point. Columbus's previous failures to establish a thriving economy in the New World, combined with his harsh treatment of the indigenous populations and the settlers, began to create a climate of unrest. Many of the colonists were unhappy with his leadership, and complaints about his governance reached Spain. The settlers, who had expected the New World to be a land of opportunity, were growing increasingly disillusioned with the slow progress and harsh conditions. Diseases, famine, and the lack of substantial wealth had made life in the colonies unbearable for many, and Columbus's inability to address these issues effectively eroded his popularity. In addition to the unrest among the settlers, Columbus was facing growing opposition from his own men. His 2 previous voyages had been marked by tensions between him and some of his officers, but by the time of the 3rd voyage, the situation had reached a breaking point. His brother, Bartholomew, who had previously been one of his most loyal supporters, found himself caught in a growing conflict between Columbus and other officials. As the complaints against Columbus mounted, so did the pressure on the Spanish crown to address the situation. Columbus's leadership was increasingly questioned. His harsh methods, his failure to establish a stable economy, and his inability to ensure the success of the colonies had caused widespread discontent. In addition, Columbus's increasingly erratic behavior, his tendency to rely on military force to solve problems, and his refusal to take advice from experienced governors and officers further alienated him from those around him. Columbus's dreams of building a Spanish empire in the New World were rapidly disintegrating, and his relationship with the Spanish court was becoming more strained. In 1499, Columbus's brother, Francisco de Bobadilla, was sent to the Caribbean with a fleet and the authority to investigate the situation in the colonies. Bobadilla arrived in Hispaniola to find a situation that was even worse than he had been led to believe. The settlers were in open rebellion, and Columbus's leadership was in complete disarray. In addition to the complaints about Columbus's governance, there were reports of cruelty and mistreatment of the indigenous populations. Columbus's failure to bring any significant wealth or resources back to Spain, combined with his inability to manage the colonies effectively, made him appear to be an incompetent and ineffective leader. The Spanish crown, under pressure from the growing unrest in the colonies, decided to take action. Columbus was arrested by Bobadilla and removed from power. He was accused of mismanagement, tyranny, and abuse of power. His authority as governor was revoked, and he was sent back to Spain in chains. This was a stunning fall from grace for a man who had once been hailed as a hero for his discovery of the New World. The arrest of Columbus and his return to Spain in chains was a deeply humiliating moment in his career. When he arrived in Spain, Columbus was treated with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. The Spanish monarchs, Isabella and Ferdinand, had been forced to intervene after years of complaints about Columbus's rule, but they still held him in high regard for his original achievements. However, the damage had already been done. Columbus's reputation had been severely tarnished by his failures in the colonies, and the royal court was no longer willing to tolerate his actions. In Spain, Columbus was allowed to defend himself before the Spanish court. He argued that the charges against him were exaggerated and that his actions had been necessary to maintain order in the colonies. He also claimed that the unrest was caused by the failure of the settlers to appreciate the challenges of establishing a colony in the New World. However, his arguments fell on deaf ears. The Spanish monarchy, while still acknowledging his discovery of the New World, could not ignore the widespread discontent that had spread throughout the Caribbean colonies. Despite the charges against him, Columbus was not imprisoned, but his power and influence were effectively stripped away. He was allowed to retain the title of Admiral of the Ocean Seas, but his authority to govern the New World was permanently revoked. The Spanish crown chose to appoint a new governor to oversee the colonies, and Columbus was relegated to the role of a figurehead. Though Columbus was never fully removed from the history of exploration, the 3rd voyage marked the beginning of his fall from grace. His leadership was discredited, and his dream of building a Spanish empire in the New World collapsed under the weight of his failures. The 3rd voyage was an attempt to redeem himself, but it ultimately led to his disgrace and the end of his active role in the colonization of the Americas. Columbus's fall from grace serves as a reminder of the complexities and challenges of colonization. While his initial voyages opened up the Americas to European exploration and settlement, the realities of governance, exploitation, and indigenous resistance proved far more difficult than Columbus had anticipated. His 3rd voyage, filled with exploration, discovery, and conflict, marks the tragic end of his ambitions for glory and empire in the New World. His arrest and return to Spain in chains symbolized the collapse of the grand vision that had driven him and the dawning realization that even the greatest explorers are not immune to failure. Columbus's 4th voyage, which began in May 1502, was marked by desperation, failure, and an indomitable will to continue his search for a passage to Asia, even as his previous attempts had failed and his credibility had been severely damaged. This expedition, his final journey across the Atlantic, was supposed to redeem him in the eyes of the Spanish crown, offering one last chance to prove his worth as an explorer and to fulfill his long-standing dream of finding a direct route to the riches of the East. Yet, despite his persistence and determination, this voyage was nothing short of a disaster, one that would mark the final chapter of his storied, though controversial, career. After his arrest and disgrace following the third voyage, Columbus had been granted one last opportunity by the Spanish monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella. They were still aware of his earlier contributions to exploration and wanted to give him a chance to recover some semblance of his former glory. Columbus had long maintained that the Americas were just a stepping stone to the east, that Asia could be reached by continuing to sail westward. He was determined to prove that a westward route to the Spice Islands, now part of the East Indies, was the key to Spain's fortunes. With 4 ships and a relatively small crew, Columbus set sail from Cadiz in southern Spain on May 9, 1502. His mission was clear: to continue searching for the fabled Western Passage to Asia. However, this expedition, unlike his earlier ones, was deeply burdened with the weight of his failures. His reputation had suffered irreparable damage, and he was no longer seen as the brilliant navigator who had opened the New World. The pressure of living up to the promises he had made to the Spanish crown only added to the already heavy burden on his shoulders. The journey was a difficult one from the start. After leaving Spain, Columbus sailed first to the Canary Islands, where he made some repairs to his ships. From there, he set off toward the Caribbean, hoping to find the elusive passage. However, the voyage encountered a series of setbacks, and the difficulties that awaited Columbus were immediately apparent. The ships faced rough seas, and Columbus struggled to find the right route. He followed the same pattern as on previous voyages, making landfall on various islands in the Caribbean. He attempted to explore the coast of Honduras, but he failed to find the route he sought. One of the most difficult aspects of the fourth voyage was the growing sense of isolation that Columbus experienced. He had once been hailed as a visionary, but now, many of his men were skeptical of his judgment and leadership. The toll of 3 previous failed expeditions had eroded the crew's confidence, and tensions were high. They had little faith in his claims that they were nearing the passage to Asia. His inability to provide them with the promised wealth, coupled with the hardships they faced, led to open mutiny among his men. The crew had little trust in their leader and began to lose hope, seeing the journey as an endless, fruitless pursuit. Despite these setbacks, Columbus pressed on. He landed on the coast of Central America, hoping to find a breakthrough. In the region of present-day Honduras, he attempted to explore the coast in search of a passage, but his attempts were frustrated by bad weather, hostile interactions with indigenous people, and the difficult geography. His plan to explore the region further faltered, and his journey grew more aimless as he sought desperately to find any sign of the passage that had driven his dreams for years. But his troubles were not limited to his failure to find the passage. Columbus faced increasing pressure from the Spanish crown to deliver results, and the resources at his disposal were stretched thin. Food became scarce, and the men began to suffer from hunger and disease. The journey turned into a constant struggle for survival, and the morale of the crew was at an all-time low. They were stranded in a foreign land, far from the comforts of Spain, with little hope of success. Columbus's role as the captain was increasingly questioned, but he held on to his belief that he could still find the passage to Asia. His dream had become an obsession, clouding his judgment and leaving him unwilling to give up. Things took a turn for the worse when Columbus's ships were caught in a powerful storm while he was attempting to navigate the waters off the coast of Panama. The storm wreaked havoc on his fleet, and one of his ships, the Santa Maria, was severely damaged. Columbus was forced to seek shelter on the island of Jamaica, where he and his crew were marooned for more than a year. This period of isolation was one of the most difficult times in Columbus's career, and it marked the lowest point of his life as an explorer. Stranded on Jamaica with limited supplies, Columbus was forced to rely on his resourcefulness and leadership to keep the crew alive. The island's indigenous population, initially wary of the Europeans, eventually began to trade with Columbus and his men, providing them with food and other essentials. However, the situation remained dire. Columbus's ability to maintain order among the men was put to the test, as hunger, disease, and a lack of supplies threatened the very survival of the expedition. His reputation had already been tarnished, and now his authority was being undermined by the increasingly hostile environment. Throughout this period, Columbus attempted to communicate with the Spanish authorities, sending out messages via intercepted ships in hopes of receiving help. His situation, however, continued to deteriorate, and the hope of ever finding the passage to Asia faded with each passing month. The Spaniards in the Caribbean, including the governor of Hispaniola, who had been one of Columbus's early supporters, refused to send aid, and his entreaties went unanswered for months. In the meantime, Columbus's health began to fail, and his spirit was broken. Finally, in the summer of 1504, after nearly a year on the island, Columbus was able to arrange for the rescue of his men. The Spanish authorities sent a ship to bring him back to Spain, but by the time he arrived he was in poor health, physically exhausted and emotionally drained. The years of failed voyages, the disappointments, the constant strain of leadership, and the struggles of survival had taken a profound. Columbus's fourth voyage did not end in the triumph he had so desperately hoped for. Rather than securing his place as a great explorer and fulfilling his dream of finding a western passage to Asia, it further cemented his reputation as a man who had failed to deliver on his promises. His desperate search for the passage became symbolic of the limits of his ambition, and his final voyage stood as a testament to his persistence, but also to the failure of his grand vision. While his early voyages had changed the course of history, the fourth voyage ended with no significant discoveries or riches, and his dream of glory in the East remained unfulfilled. Upon his return to Spain, Columbus was greeted with indifference. The Spanish monarchy, though still acknowledging his accomplishments, had little interest in further funding his endeavors. He was effectively sidelined from exploration, and his hopes of embarking on another voyage or receiving a generous reward from the crown were dashed. Columbus's reputation had been permanently damaged by his failed final expedition, and his legacy became a mixture of both triumph and tragedy. Columbus's fourth voyage ended the way his journey had begun, with a series of struggles, failures, and broken dreams. It was the culmination of a lifetime of exploration that had begun with the hope of finding a western passage to Asia and ended with the cold reality of a man who had been unable to realize his most ambitious ambitions. The story of Columbus's last voyage is one of resilience in the face of adversity, but it is also a story of the limits of human ambition and the harsh realities of the world that Columbus had hoped to conquer. Christopher Columbus's death, which occurred on May 20, 1506, was the final chapter in the life of one of history's most controversial and consequential figures. Although he died without knowing the true extent of his discoveries, Columbus left behind a legacy that would shape the course of history. His death, however, did not mark the end of the story. Rather, it gave rise to a series of legal, physical, and historical uncertainties that would continue to fuel debates and controversies for centuries. At the time of Columbus's death, the world had already begun to change as a result of his voyages. His discovery of the Americas in 1492 opened up a new world of possibilities, and in the years that followed, Spain, Portugal, and other European powers began to explore and colonize the New World. However, while Columbus's voyages had brought Europe into contact with the Americas, his own role in those events was far from clear-cut. Columbus had never fully realized the magnitude of his discoveries. He continued to believe that he had found a new route to Asia, and had never recognized the existence of the continents that lay in the way. As a result, Columbus died with a sense of incompletion, unable to grasp the full significance of his work. Columbus's death left behind a complicated and fractured legacy. At the time, his achievements were still celebrated in Spain, where he had been hailed as a great navigator and hero. The Spanish crown, though not always supportive of Columbus's ideas, recognized the value of his voyages in terms of their potential for wealth and prestige. Columbus had been granted titles, honors, and lands for his services to the crown, and the rewards of his discoveries were still being realized. However, the nature of Columbus's legacy was not universally admired, and many of his contemporaries and later generations would view him with a more critical eye. In the years following his death, Columbus's legacy became the subject of intense debate. One of the central issues that arose was the legal and financial status of his estate. Columbus had been granted various privileges by the Spanish crown, including titles and vast estates in the New World. However, after his death, his heirs faced a complex legal battle to claim the rights and privileges that had been promised to Columbus. The Spanish crown, particularly under the rule of Ferdinand and Isabella's successors, was reluctant to honor these promises fully. Columbus's heirs, his son Diego Columbus in particular, found themselves embroiled in a long-running legal struggle to secure their inheritance and restore the family's fortunes. The legal disputes that followed Columbus's death were centered around his rights to the lands he had discovered and the lucrative trade routes he had opened. Diego Columbus, as the son of the explorer, believed he was entitled to the same rights and privileges that had been promised to his father. However, the Spanish monarchy, which had grown increasingly powerful, was less inclined to fulfill those promises. The crown was also looking to assert greater control over the territories Columbus had discovered, and it sought to weaken Columbus's heirs' claims to those lands. The battle for Columbus's estate dragged on for several years, with multiple lawsuits filed in both Spain and the New World. Eventually, Diego Columbus was able to secure some of his father's titles and land holdings, but much of the wealth and influence that Columbus had hoped to pass on to his descendants was lost. This legal struggle over Columbus's legacy highlights the uncertainty and ambiguity that surrounded his contributions. Despite his pivotal role in opening up the Americas to European exploration and colonization, Columbus's heirs were unable to fully benefit from his achievements. Beyond the legal challenges, Columbus's physical legacy also became a subject of dispute. Columbus had been buried in Valladolid, Spain, but in the years following his death, his remains were moved multiple times. His remains were first relocated to Seville and then, in 1537, to the island of Hispaniola in the Caribbean. In 1795, after Spain ceded the island to France, Columbus's remains were again moved, this time to Havana, Cuba. Following the Spanish-American War in 1898, Columbus's remains were sent back to Seville. Over the centuries, the movement of Columbus's remains symbolized the uncertainty and confusion surrounding his life and death. The physical remains of Columbus have been the subject of numerous investigations, particularly during the 20th and 21st centuries. In the 2000s, DNA testing was conducted on the remains that had been returned to Seville to determine whether they were truly those of Columbus. The results of these tests were inconclusive, leaving open the possibility that Columbus's remains had been lost or misidentified during the various relocations. This uncertainty surrounding the physical remains of Columbus mirrored the larger historical ambiguity surrounding his legacy. Despite the legal and physical uncertainties, Columbus's historical legacy grew over time. In the centuries following his death, Columbus became an increasingly important figure in the development of European colonialism and imperialism. His voyages to the Americas paved the way for the widespread exploration and colonization of the New World by European powers, particularly Spain and Portugal. Columbus's discovery of the Americas sparked the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade, the exploitation of indigenous populations, and the establishment of European settlements across the Americas. For many years, Columbus was celebrated as a heroic figure, a symbol of European progress and exploration. His role in the discovery of the Americas was framed as a moment of triumph, and his image was used to justify European domination over the indigenous peoples of the New World. Columbus Day, celebrated in many parts of the Americas, became a national holiday in the United States and other countries, serving as a reminder of his legacy as an explorer. However, as the 20th century progressed, Columbus's legacy became increasingly controversial. Scholars and activists began to critically reassess his role in history, particularly in relation to the treatment of indigenous peoples. Columbus's arrival in the Americas marked the beginning of a period of brutal colonization, during which millions of indigenous people were enslaved, killed, or displaced. The history of European colonialism in the Americas, with its violence and exploitation, led many to question the veneration of Columbus as a hero. Critics argued that Columbus's discovery was not a moment of triumph, but the beginning of a dark chapter in history, one that had devastating consequences for native populations. This growing recognition of the negative consequences of Columbus's voyages led to a re-evaluation of his place in history. In recent decades, Columbus's legacy has been the subject of heated debate, particularly in the United States, where the celebration of Columbus Day has become increasingly controversial. Many indigenous groups and activists have called for the abolition of the holiday, arguing that it celebrates a man who initiated a period of violence and displacement for indigenous peoples. In response, some cities and states have replaced Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day, recognizing the historical injustices that followed Columbus's arrival in the Americas. Despite the controversies surrounding Columbus's legacy, there is no denying the profound impact of his voyages. Columbus's expeditions opened up a new world of exploration, trade, and colonization. They set the stage for the vast European empires that would dominate the globe for centuries. Columbus's story is inextricably linked to the history of the Americas, both in terms of the opportunities it provided for European powers and the suffering it caused for indigenous peoples. His legacy, therefore, remains complex and multifaceted, a mixture of achievement and tragedy. In the end, Columbus's death did not end the controversy surrounding his life and legacy. His contributions to history, while undeniably significant, continue to be the subject of ongoing debate. Columbus's story is not just one of discovery and exploration, but also one of conflict, exploitation, and the consequences of European colonialism. As we continue to reflect on his life and its impact, it is important to recognize both the achievements and the darker aspects of his legacy. The uncertainty that surrounded Columbus's death and the controversies that followed reflect the ongoing struggle to understand and come to terms with the full scope of his influence on the world. The Columbian Exchange refers to the profound and far-reaching exchange of goods, ideas, people, and diseases that followed the arrival of Europeans in the Americas, particularly after Christopher Columbus's voyages in the late 15th century. This exchange would shape the world for centuries to come, forever altering the course of history. It was a global transformation that transcended borders, revolutionizing not only the biological and agricultural landscapes of the Old and New Worlds, but also impacting social structures, economies, cultures, and human interactions across continents. The consequences of this exchange are both dramatic and complex, spanning both beneficial and catastrophic effects. The interaction between the indigenous peoples of the Americas and the European explorers and colonizers ignited one of the most significant periods of transformation in human history, and the consequences of this contact still reverberate today. At the core of the Columbian Exchange was the movement of crops and animals. Before European exploration, the Americas had a thriving array of unique flora and fauna. The indigenous peoples of the Americas had cultivated and domesticated plants like maize, corn, potatoes, tomatoes, cacao, from which chocolate is derived, and a variety of beans, squashes, and other crops. These crops, particularly maize, potatoes, and tomatoes, would prove to be transformative for the Old World. Maize, for example, became a staple crop in many parts of Europe, especially southern and eastern Europe, where it was grown in regions that were not traditionally suitable for wheat or barley. Potatoes, once introduced to Europe, became a staple food in countries like Ireland, Scotland, and northern Italy, where the harsh climate made growing other crops difficult. The adaptability of the potato made it an essential food source that could sustain large populations. Tomatoes, once a novel introduction from the Americas, revolutionized Mediterranean cuisine, becoming an essential ingredient in Italian, Spanish, and other European cuisines. Cacao, the source of chocolate, was similarly transformative. Its introduction to Europe in the 16th century marked the beginning of chocolate's widespread popularity, which would eventually become a global industry. The impact of these crops was immense, as they provided new food sources that would support growing populations, reduce famine, and change dietary habits across Europe, Africa, and Asia. On the flip side, the Old World brought with it a range of new crops, animals, and agricultural practices that dramatically altered the agricultural landscape of the Americas. Europeans introduced wheat, barley, rice, and sugarcane to the New World, all of which became important staples in the Americas. Sugarcane, in particular, would become a key crop, with vast sugar plantations springing up in the Caribbean and Brazil, which required an enormous labor force, leading directly to the Atlantic slave trade. Additionally, domesticated animals like cattle, horses, pigs, and sheep were introduced to the Americas. These animals transformed the way indigenous peoples interacted with their environment. Horses, for example, revolutionized transport, hunting, and warfare in many parts of North America, especially for the indigenous peoples of the Great Plains. Pigs and cattle, which were raised for meat and leather, multiplied rapidly and changed the diet. However, the most significant consequence of contact was not just the exchange of plants, animals, and goods, but the introduction of diseases from Europe, Asia, and Africa to the Americas. Indigenous populations in the Americas had no immunity to diseases like smallpox, measles, influenza, and typhus, which had evolved in the densely populated, urbanized societies of Europe, Asia, and Africa. As a result, the arrival of Europeans in the Americas triggered one of the most devastating demographic collapses in human history. Entire civilizations, including the Aztec, Inca, and various Native American groups, were decimated by these diseases. It is estimated that up to 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas perished in the decades following European contact. The spread of disease was not the only harmful consequence of the Columbian Exchange. European colonization and the establishment of plantation economies led to the forced displacement and exploitation of millions of indigenous peoples. The Spanish, Portuguese, English, French, and Dutch colonizers relied on systems of forced labor, particularly in the Caribbean and South America, to work the plantations that produced sugar, tobacco, cotton, and other valuable commodities. The introduction of sugarcane and the expansion of sugar plantations required an immense labor force, leading to the establishment of the transatlantic slave trade. Africans were forcibly taken from their homelands and transported to the Americas, where they worked in brutal conditions on plantations. This dark chapter of history, known as the Atlantic slave trade, resulted in the forced migration of millions of Africans to the New World, forever changing the demographic and cultural landscapes of the Americas. While the forced migration of Africans to the Americas had profound social, cultural, and economic consequences, the arrival of Europeans in the New World also brought with it the establishment of new forms of government, trade, and social organization. European colonizers sought to impose their own systems of governance and legal structures on the indigenous peoples of the Americas. Spanish and Portuguese colonial policies were particularly focused on exploiting natural resources and establishing monopolies on trade. The Spanish crown, in particular, granted encomiendas, land grants, to Spanish settlers, allowing them to extract tribute from the indigenous populations in exchange for protection and conversion to Christianity. This system of forced labor and exploitation led to widespread suffering and resistance from indigenous peoples, who were often brutally suppressed. The emergence of the European colonial powers in the Americas also transformed the global economy. The riches extracted from the New World, including precious metals like gold and silver, played a key role in the development of global trade networks. Spanish and Portuguese empires profited immensely from these resources, with silver mined in Mexico and Peru being sent back to Europe, fueling the rise of Spain and Portugal as dominant world powers in the 16th century. These riches, however, did not only benefit the colonizers. The influx of precious metals and goods from the Americas led to the rise of a global trading system that connected the Old and New Worlds. The establishment of colonial plantations, mining operations, and trade routes transformed economies across Europe, Africa, and Asia, contributing to the rise of capitalism and the early stages of the global economic system we recognize today. The Columbian Exchange was not confined to the biological, economic, and political realms alone. The cultural impact of European colonization in the Americas was immense. The encounter between European settlers and indigenous peoples led to cultural exchanges, though these exchanges were often marked by exploitation, violence, and forced assimilation. Europeans introduced Christianity to the Americas, leading to the widespread conversion of indigenous peoples. This religious conversion was often accompanied by the destruction of native religions, languages, and traditions. In the Americas, indigenous peoples were often forced to adopt European customs, languages, and ways of life, with their own cultures being marginalized or erased in the process. Furthermore, European colonization also introduced new ideas about race, ethnicity, and identity that would shape the social and cultural landscapes of the Americas for centuries. The development of racial hierarchies, based on skin color and ethnicity, became a defining feature of colonial society. Africans, indigenous peoples, and later mestizos, those of mixed European and indigenous descent, were often subjected to discrimination and exploitation, which had long-lasting effects on social structures and racial dynamics in the Americas. The legacy of the Columbian Exchange and colonization is still evident in the modern world. The vast exchange of goods, people, ideas, and diseases has left a profound imprint on global history. The introduction of new crops and animals reshaped diets and agricultural practices worldwide. The forced migration of Africans to the Americas gave rise to the African diaspora, which has had a significant cultural, social, and political impact on the Americas. The demographic collapse of indigenous populations in the Americas, due to disease and colonization, remains one of the darkest episodes in world history. The social, political, and cultural ramifications of colonization continue to shape contemporary issues, from discussions about reparations and decolonization to ongoing struggles for indigenous rights and racial equality. In conclusion, the consequences of the Columbian exchange and colonization were vast and transformative, affecting every aspect of the Old and New Worlds. The exchange of crops, animals, and goods reshaped the global economy and revolutionized agriculture, while the movement of people, diseases, and ideas fundamentally altered the demographic and cultural landscapes of the Americas. The legacy of Columbus's encounters with the indigenous peoples of the Americas is both a story of innovation and exploitation, of exchange and destruction. The transformative impacts of these events continue to reverberate across the globe, reminding us of the interconnectedness of human history and the enduring consequences of contact between different worlds. Christopher Columbus, the Genoese navigator, has long been regarded as one of history's great figures. His voyages across the Atlantic in the late 15th century set in motion one of the most transformative periods in world history, connecting the Old World with the New. However, his legacy is not without controversy. Over time, the memory and myth of Columbus have evolved, shaped by shifting historical perspectives and societal values. The image of Columbus as a hero, visionary, and pioneer of European exploration has been challenged in modern debates, with critics pointing to the violence, exploitation, and colonization that followed his voyages. This reevaluation of Columbus's legacy is not simply a matter of historical accuracy, but is also closely tied to ongoing discussions about race, colonialism, and the construction of national identities. For centuries, Columbus was largely celebrated as the discoverer of the New World, a title that, in retrospect, can be seen as both misleading and Eurocentric. Early historical accounts, particularly those written by Europeans in the centuries following his voyages, painted Columbus as a courageous, intrepid adventurer who bridged the gap between two worlds, forever changing the course of history. His journey to the Americas was mythologized, and Columbus became a symbol of European dominance and the triumph of Western civilization. The popular narrative of Columbus as the hero who discovered America served to justify the subsequent colonization of the New World and the exploitation of its indigenous populations. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, Columbus was increasingly idealized, particularly in the United States. His arrival in the Americas was celebrated as a founding moment in the history of Western civilization. In 1892, the 400th anniversary of Columbus's first voyage was commemorated with grand celebrations, particularly in the United States, which had recently emerged as a global power. Columbus was depicted as a symbol of American exceptionalism, an embodiment of the spirit of exploration and progress. Statues of Columbus were erected in public spaces across the United States, and the celebration of Columbus Day became a national holiday in 1937. The figure of Columbus, as an embodiment of discovery and pioneering spirit, was woven into the fabric of American identity, reinforcing ideas of manifest destiny and the expansion of American influence across the continent. However, as historical scholarship has advanced, Columbus's legacy has come under increasing scrutiny. The romanticized narrative of Columbus as the heroic explorer has been questioned by scholars, indigenous groups, and critics of colonialism. Columbus's voyages, while historically significant, also marked the beginning of a brutal era of colonization, exploitation, and genocide for the indigenous peoples of the Americas. Columbus himself enslaved, tortured, and killed indigenous people, and his expeditions paved the way for the brutal systems of colonization that followed. His encounters with the Taino people in the Caribbean, for example, were marked by violence, enslavement, and the imposition of European diseases that decimated native populations. The harsh reality of Columbus's encounters with the indigenous peoples of the Americas has led to a reevaluation of his legacy, particularly in the context of modern debates about colonialism, racism, and indigenous rights. Many indigenous groups view Columbus not as a hero, but as a symbol of European oppression and colonial violence. For these communities, Columbus's arrival marked the beginning of centuries of suffering, displacement, and cultural erasure. The destruction of native cultures, the decimation of indigenous populations through violence and disease, and the imposition of European social, political, and economic systems are central to the memory of Columbus for many indigenous peoples. In recent decades, the re-evaluation of Columbus's legacy has led to a growing movement to reconsider the commemoration of Columbus Day. Critics argue that the holiday, which has been celebrated in the United States for over 80 years, serves to whitewash the violent history of European colonization and its impact on indigenous peoples. In place of Columbus Day, many indigenous activists and their allies have called for the establishment of Indigenous Peoples Day, a holiday that would honor the history, culture, and contributions of indigenous peoples, while acknowledging the harm caused by European colonization. The debate over Columbus Day has sparked protests, legal battles, and growing calls for the removal of Columbus statues from public spaces, particularly in cities with large indigenous populations. The movement to reconsider Columbus's legacy has gained momentum in recent years, driven in part by broader social movements focused on racial justice and the reckoning with the legacies of slavery, segregation, and colonialism. The Black Lives Matter movement, for example, has highlighted the ways in which historical figures like Columbus are celebrated while their actions and impact on marginalized communities are overlooked. The call for the removal of Confederate monuments in the United States, as well as the broader push for decolonization, has brought renewed attention to Columbus's controversial legacy and prompted discussions about how we remember the past. In addition to the push for the removal of Columbus statues and the renaming of Columbus Day, the re-evaluation of Columbus's legacy has sparked debates within academic and historical circles. Historians have increasingly emphasized the complexity of Columbus's actions and the need to critically examine the consequences of his voyages. While Columbus's journeys were undeniably significant in terms of connecting Europe to the Americas, they also initiated a period of profound disruption for indigenous peoples who faced forced labor, violence, and the destruction of their way of life. Some historians have called for a more nuanced view of Columbus, one that recognizes both his accomplishments as an explorer and the negative consequences of his actions. Rather than demonizing Columbus entirely or idealizing him as a hero, the goal is to understand the full scope of his legacy and the historical context in which his actions took place. The debate over Columbus's legacy also reflects broader tensions about national identity and the construction of historical narratives. In the United States, the figure of Columbus has long been intertwined with ideas of American exceptionalism and the myth of the nation's founding. The idea that Columbus discovered America was central to the American narrative of progress and expansion, and challenging that narrative can feel threatening to those who view it as part of the country's foundational mythology. Similarly, the legacy of Columbus is tied to broader questions about the role of colonialism in shaping modern Western societies. Many critics argue that the history of European colonization has been sanitized and that the impacts of colonization, particularly on indigenous peoples, are often overlooked or minimized in mainstream historical accounts. In countries across the Americas, the legacy of Columbus is experienced differently. In Latin American countries, for example, Columbus is often viewed as a symbol of European colonial oppression. While some countries, like Colombia and the Dominican Republic, continue to celebrate Columbus's voyages, others have moved toward acknowledging the painful history of colonization. In 2004, for instance, Venezuela's President Hugo Chavez declared that Columbus Day should be replaced with Indigenous Resistance Day, a reflection of the country's ongoing reckoning with its colonial past. Similarly, countries like Ecuador and Bolivia have taken steps to recognize the contributions and histories of indigenous peoples, challenging the dominant narrative that elevates Columbus as a hero. In Europe, Columbus's legacy is similarly contested, particularly in Italy, where his origins are celebrated but also examined through a critical lens. In Genoa, where Columbus was born, statues and monuments to the explorer are common, but debates about his legacy have become more prevalent in recent years. In the city's public discourse, Columbus is often seen as a complex figure, both an intrepid explorer and a harbinger of a violent colonial era. The memory of Columbus is not fixed, and it is continually reshaped by historical events, social movements, and changing public perceptions. While Columbus remains a key figure in world history, the way in which his legacy is understood continues to evolve. As society continues to confront the ongoing consequences of colonialism and grapple with issues of race, identity, and historical memory, Columbus's role in shaping the modern world remains the subject of ongoing debate. The myth of Columbus as a heroic explorer may no longer hold the same unquestioned power it once did, but it has been replaced by a more complicated and contested understanding of his impact. a legacy that encompasses both triumph and tragedy, discovery and destruction. The modern debate surrounding Columbus highlights the tension between memory and myth. The myth of Columbus as the great discoverer and hero of European exploration has been integral to national narratives in Europe and the Americas. Yet this myth has been increasingly challenged by a more critical understanding of his voyages and their consequences. The lasting symbolism of Columbus, both as a figure of pride and as a symbol of oppression, reflects the complexities of historical memory and the ways in which the past continues to shape the present. As societies continue to grapple with the legacies of colonialism and explore the diverse experiences of marginalized peoples, Columbus's place in history will remain a point of contention, a symbol of both human achievement and historical injustice.